RiseAbsorb is redefining what growers expect from phosphate fertilizer. Backed by data and built for performance, RiseAbsorb helps reduce phosphorus losses, improve uptake, and boost ROI without increasing input costs. Join the next wave of growers switching to the next generation of phosphorus fertilizers by visiting phospholutions.com.
I'm Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture, and joining me now, it's Peter Wheat Johnson. Pete, how are you?
Yeah, I am just enjoying chatting with you, Lindsay. It's just awesome, and things are. It's hard to stay upbeat sometimes when it's this dry, but at the end of the day, Paul Toohey, may he rest in peace, just my local elevator operator for years and years and years, and his mantra was, "Dry weather will scare you to death. Wet weather will starve you to death." Now, if I'm farming in the Palliser Triangle in Western Canada, I'm shaking my head right now saying Paul Toohey was not a very smart man.
But for Ontario, yeah.
Exactly. In Ontario, it's often the case. And so I am hanging on to that. Bob Nielsen, at the end of one of his articles about drought impacts on corn yields, said that corn has an incredible capability to recover if it does get moisture, and it has amazing resilience to drought stress, recovers surprisingly well. And if you're really down and out, just remember the quote from Yogi Berra, "It ain't over till it's over." So right now, because my crops are not looking very good, they are fighting hard, but they're going backwards and they need moisture. I am hanging on to those mantras that it ain't over till it's over, and dry weather is just scaring me to death.
So I think so this past week while we were off, I did do quite a bit of crop touring, because that's what farmers do when they go out, even to find a lake, a river. It doesn't matter. You're still going to crop tour. And also, of course, Chris and I are part of the Soil Network. We're part of the Grazing Network here in Ontario. And there are certainly areas where it probably is over. I mean, there is an incredible drought in a very concentrated area of central Ontario, that, we're talking about thin soil, and some crops they've given up, and they're dealing with, how do we deal with, can we turn it into feed? What are the considerations there, which maybe we can touch on. But for many other parts of Ontario, we are in definitely a dry bias to a very dry and to droughty. I know Warren Schneckenberger is dealing with it around Morrisburg as well. But as you mentioned, a well-timed rain at this point, which looks like could be tomorrow into Thursday, depending on where you are in the province. We could see some rain come through. How do the beans react to something like that? How does corn react to something like that? Because you mentioned corn can be quite drought resilient, but everybody knows August rain makes those soybeans. And if we don't get any, then what happens?
Yeah, so soybeans and corn are different, and which is obvious, but I find the difference is really amazing. So corn, after it tassels and starts developing the cob, root growth is really minimal. The cob is such a big sink, and its pollination window is kind of a single time frame. It silks, it drops pollen, and you have that 4, 5, 7 day window that it's done, and you either get pollination or you don't get pollination. And after that, and the drive for photosynthate to the cob means that very little root growth happens. Soybeans, because they're a more indeterminate crop, they continue to grow roots if they can. And in fact, in that first window, kind of that R1 to R3, and most of us are past R3 at this point. So R3 is where we get the tiny pod at the upper 4 nodes, right? The up like 3/4 inch long pod at one of the most fully expanded trifoliates, top 4 nodes. But they are growing roots at up to 2.5 inches per day, or at least 2.3 inches per day throughout that period. And so if you're under drought, but there's moisture deeper, and remember, soybeans don't do a lot of early growth, so they haven't used a lot of that soil moisture. They just haven't been pumping the same amount of water that the corn crop has, and that's why these August rains matter, because up until mid July rather, or at least early July, they have pumped almost no water. They're small. They're kind of a small canopy. Corn, by the way, first of July, it can be shoulder high, and it's pumped a tremendous amount of water. So the soybean roots continue to grow deep. They continue to try to find moisture, and they continue to grow roots. Some varieties, and not all varieties are made equal in this situation, but they can continue to grow roots right up until R6. So they can handle that drought better if, and these are big ifs, Lindsay, if the soil allows them to continue to grow roots deeper and there is moisture at depth. We talked about compaction. Man, if it's compacted at depth, they won't be able to grow roots. And even if they do grow roots, there's not nearly as many roots get that deep. And you really have to count on that moisture to move through capillary action to get to those soybean roots. And so lots of growers have been, saying, okay, Pete, so tomorrow they're kind of forecasting, and it depends on where you're at, but they're 10 mils, right? 4/10 of an inch of rain. So if I get a half-inch rain or I get a 1-inch rain tomorrow night, how much does that actually help? How long will that carry me? And so for the soybean crop, it's sort of at maximum water use. It's in that range of a quarter to maybe 3/10 of an inch per day. So a half-inch rain is 2 days, and it's really not that much. With the corn crop, it's moving past its maximum water use phase, which is about a third of an inch of water per day, and it's backed off to maybe 2/10 of an inch of water per day, or maybe it's still at a quarter. So half an inch again is 2 days. But I really liked Brett's thought process about this. So it's okay, Pete, but what you're telling me is that I get that half-inch rain, and the soybean plant's going to suck that rain up. It's going to use that rain. It's going to send more photosynthate because the root depth thing is driven by drought conditions 3 to 5 days earlier. So 3 to 5 days ago, it was under drought stress. It's going to send lots of photosynthate, use that moisture, make photosynthate, send that down to the roots, get them to grow deeper. And it gives me 2 days for the capillary action to work. So it's sort of like it gives time for the reinforcements to get there to give me more impact than just 2 days worth of water. And it's 100% correct. So these rainfalls, even though they may not be that much, can have tremendous positive benefit in terms of how the crops respond.
I love it. Send in the reinforcements, dear roots. Send me more. So this is fascinating as well, because you touched on the compaction, because again, the roots will continue to grow if they can continue to move past, say, a hard pan or through the soil. There's also the component of how much soil moisture is actually available. And that is, yes, dependent on rainfall earlier, but it's also on how much your soil can hold. And not to toot my own horn here, but we're seeing some significant differences between fields based on hay, forage, pasture grazing, and cover cropping in the mix versus those that have been continually either beans on beans, corn on corn, or just alternating between corn and beans. So how much does field history play in here when we do get into these dry conditions?
Yeah, so that is where management plays by far the biggest impact. And everybody this year, by the way, Lindsay, has whined at me about, Pete, the price of wheat, it's just so low that we just cannot afford to plant as much wheat in the fall of 2025 as we did in the fall of 2024 because the economics are horrible. And then I'm listening to them say, but by the way, we had awesome wheat yields this year, best ever, or above average, or he's the odd person that wasn't that good, Lindsay. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, that wheat, because it has a different grain fill period, everybody's pretty happy with their wheat yields. They may not be so happy. Particularly, we went for a drive yesterday. I mentioned that already. We saw soybeans that were so drought stressed, they have already dropped all their leaves. A couple of weeks ago, Dan Petker tweeted out a picture on his sand soil of corn 3 feet tall in tassel. There's no yield there. And so a zero yield versus, 120 bushel wheat crop, which would you rather have? So keeping not all your eggs in one basket is really important. But the other thing that rotation really does is anytime you are severely stressed, whether it's dry weather or wet weather, that's when the benefit of a better rotation that includes, in Ontario's case, that includes winter wheat, that includes cover crops, you can get up to at least a 20 and sometimes as much as 30% yield increase because of that increased organic matter, that increased soil tilth. It was just phenomenally interesting when I was out with Brett on Sunday. We looked at some cornfields and same hybrid planted roughly the same day. There was a few differences, but he happened to have a 5 acre chunk. And to go back to your pasture, Lindsay, it had just come out of horse pasture for who knows how long versus where he had been cropping. And Brett's in a good rotation. He's corn, soybeans, wheat, or sometimes winter barley in there. Like he's not growing too many soybeans, which are the bane of our existence when it comes to soil health.
Amen.
But the pasture, his corn had pollinated well, and he was getting 18 rows around by about 20 kernels long where he was continuous cropping. We went to the pasture field and boom, instead of 18 rows around, we had 22 rows around and still 40 kernels long. So this soil structure, this lack of compaction, this infiltration, this ability to hold water and to allow the roots to grow through the soil to access that water is absolutely massive when we get into these drought conditions.
Mm-hmm. And just a few weeks ago, we did run the audio with Bern Tobin and Jake Monroe with OMAFA talking about water infiltration and the importance of it. And we can look at it from a couple different angles, right? Like we can talk about whether it's reducing runoff or whether it's reducing, water erosion, et cetera. But it really also plays in water infiltration of getting that soil into where you need it and then holding it for the crop later.
Yeah, absolutely. And so people should go and watch that video. It's an awesome video that Bern did with Jake Monroe, but I'll just throw you some numbers because I find it phenomenally interesting. They looked at infiltration and up to a 2-inch rain. And so in the fence row, right? So that's the pasture situation. That's Lindsay's pasture where you've grown a crop this year because you're wanting to reseed it, whatever. In the pasture situation, that second inch, we'll just go with the second inch, so 1 inch to 2 inches, because that's where you get the most impact. The first inch often goes in until it seals off because you beat that soil up with tillage. The second inch in the fence row was 8 seconds, where they had alfalfa and manure 72 seconds. So that's quite a difference. 8 seconds to 72 seconds, but 72 seconds still is just over a minute. So that's not bad. Corn, soybeans, wheat, red clover was at 71 seconds. So I found that really interesting. The alfalfa plus manure was the same as the corn, soybean, wheat, red clover, but they get good red clover in that particular site. And then they moved to the continuous soybean fall plow. Any guesses, Lindsay, in terms of how many seconds that second inch took?
300.
So it was, they actually quit waiting. And that was after 20 minutes, which by the way is 1,200 seconds.
Wow.
So we go from 8 seconds to greater than 1,200 seconds.
Yeah.
that water isn't infiltrating at all, right?
No.
If you are continuous soybean fall plow, it's running off the surface. That water is not usable water, and
No.
we need that water.
Absolutely.